Before I start talk about the global changes in childbirth, let's just quickly refresh our memory. New Zealand had a different history than the United States. You used Grantley-Dick Reed. The goals were for low-risk women to achieve natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care. In the United States, classes were taught everywhere. There was a very high societal expectation that we as modern women attend the very first childbirth classes. Those methods also focused on low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical intervention. They also only focused on breathing and relaxation and to reduce your fears. For many women, the skills didn't adapt or adjust, or they weren't targeted to them. However, in the United States, what we saw was this massive reduction in suffering. It was just not acknowledged. It was seen. We experienced it. It just wasn't acknowledged because when we deal with systems, the idea in a system has results and goals. So that's what people were focused on. Birthing Better had begun to develop in the early 1970s, focused on better skills for mothers and fathers because 95% of us were laboring back then. But something happened in the late 70s and 80s. There was a massive global change. I mean, for everybody, it was a massive change. Feminism, birth control. For the first time, women could control their reproduction. We decreased the size of our families with birth control almost immediately. We wanted to go into the workforce, and people in modern societies were looking to reduce risks. Everyone knew that it's normal and natural to have risks around pregnancy and childbirth. Few risks become problems. Most problems resolve themselves without any assistance. And when we have maternity systems, delivery of service, problems through assessment, monitoring, and procedures can be resolved. Very few problems really become tragedies. Pregnancy and childbirth, by and large, are normal life events that have a good outcome. But women suffered in childbirth. They didn't cope. There weren't skills. So that was actually a bigger issue. And when that was being resolved through Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley-Dick Reed through Brandt's study, that just wasn't the goals. The goals were basically to keep low-risk birth out of being so incorporated into the modern medical society. Another thing happened in my generation, which had a huge impact on childbirth. People don't recognize. We began to wear bikinis. I know this sounds funny, but I've lived through this. I know what the conversation was. Those of us who had classical cesarean were embarrassed about our body. We couldn't wear bikinis. We didn't want to be left with an ugly scar. We also wanted to be awake in cesareans, and we wanted our husbands to be with us. And we wanted to try for vaginal births after cesareans. And we knew that a classical incision was risky. My sister-in-law lost her baby and almost died because her uterus ruptured. So women pressured the delivery of service in the United States. Medical systems respond to consumer pressure. This had a huge impact on the rise of the next childbirth trend, which was the choice-based trend. For the first time, there was a global conversation in childbirth. I attended many conferences and talked about the need for skills, and I did that for many years when there were only skills and no choices. We wanted to have skills for all births, not just low risk, and we wanted skills that adapted better and were more sustainable. People really weren't interested in the 70s about skills for everybody. WHO was beginning to look at the roles of midwives. From that conversation came the TBA programs. They also started to look at the appropriate rate of cesareans. I knew Marsden Wagner, and I spoke at many of these conferences. For the first time, home birth midwives and the natural birth movement really coordinated globally, and the whole message in childbirth changed. The famous authors we know today, and this idea that there was going to be a partnership between women and midwives, continuity of care, began to develop. This was an idea. Words were being put to that idea. And those words are carried over to today. Pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. Those are words easy to repeat. This new global childbirth conversation focused on several things: how women birth, where they birth, who's with them, and what's done to them. So the idea in this new global messaging was that women know how to birth, that it's instinctive to us because women have always birthed. And we carried on what Grantley Dick Reed said, which we just need to trust birth. People wanted us to be able to move around, to get into whatever positions we wanted to. We were told cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to be taught to birth. They need to discover birth by themselves. Midwives particularly need to sit in the corner and knit. Fathers who were birth coaches were told, you shouldn't tell women what to do. You just need to support women's choices and protect that space. This new conversation talked about the what and the where and the who. And that was the development of the birth plan, that women know what they want or don't want. Classes in the United States immediately shifted away from birth preparation, which was entirely skills, to information about pros and cons of medical assessments, monitoring, and procedures. Those became interventions. And we were told very clearly that interventions are often imposed on women and unnecessarily. We were told to make a birth plan, that we know what we want and don't want, that the delivery of service should be providing us with the birth that we want, that we should be able to say no to medical care. The implication of these choices wasn't for more women to say yes to medical care. This cropped up in New Zealand, didn't it? When doctors were confronted by women who said, I want a non-medical elective cesarean. In this period of time in the 80s, the role of midwives as primary care providers was very much discussed. New Zealand did a remarkable thing. They became primary care providers for everybody, not just low-risk women. People wanted more home births. And at that same time, because of our bikinis and the low-lying incision and the spinals and epidural and us being able to be awake for cesarean and safer VBACs and more families reducing the size of their families and being more risk adverse and the rise in the cesarean rate, we began to see changes in childbirth. At those global conferences in the 80s, I began to talk about how skills and choices should go together, the change in childbirth classes, leaving skills behind, maybe a little breathing, but focusing on choices and information. And so I carry forward that message that skills and choices should go together. Skills are what we use. They're what we do as we do the activity of birthing our baby. Choices are what we want or don't want. And we know many women globally lack choices. And we know where women do have choices, choices change. The choices can be variable. But we can always use skills if we have them. And if that societal message was focused on being able to cope, to manage, to work together, to handle, to deal with, stay on top of, and feel more in control, rather than on a particular type of birth. What happened in the 80s had a profound effect on everybody. There are many benefits. But something else happened because of this new messaging about choices and that skills were actually disparaging to women's ability to birth. No other skills-based method evolved until the 1990s. So for a 20-year period, there was no evolution of skills, with the exception of birthing better, until hypnobirthing and hypnobabies came out in the 1990s. To me, that was very sad. I was one very lonely voice in a wave of voices that said that women don't need to learn skills and fathers shouldn't be coaches.